This is episode 8 of Bible Basics, and this one's called New Testament Authors. Last time we talked about the New Testament order, and before that, the New Testament table of contents. So all these three things are kind of tied together, but specifically, here's the real important part. It is the authors that hold us together. It's the authors that caused these 27 texts to be placed in the Bible. It's who the authors were, and I'll explain more about that as we go along. The New Testament came together in the 4th and 5th century. It took place over a couple of centuries because the church at that time was organizationally independent and geographically dispersed. It spread across the Roman Empire. It spread across the world because that's what Jesus told his apostles to do. He said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. So they spread out and they went all these places. Now, the book of Acts talks about some of that, primarily about what the two most well-known apostles did, Peter and Paul. But it doesn't cover what the rest of them did. But they obviously went all these different directions because that's how big the church got. That's where churches were. And of course, churches were just synagogues that believed in Jesus. Same thing. Synagogue was a gathering of people. A church was an assembly, that the word means assembly. And it just so happened that the synagogues that happened to accept news of Messiah were called churches. Or if the majority of the synagogue, didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah and kicked out those Jews who did, they just went down the street and formed another group. So it would be Jew and Gentile together, and it would be called a church. And they're the ones to whom the apostles wrote these letters. Now, the apostles didn't write in the beginning. It took a long time, maybe 15, 20 years before the first document was written by the apostles. Why? Because Jesus had told them to go into all the world and preach the gospel. He didn't say, hey, get yourself a nice quiet room somewhere in an ivory tower and write things up and submit them for publication. No, they didn't have book markets like we know them today. I mean, there was some buying and selling of books, but nothing like we have today, and the royalty system and all that sort of stuff. They didn't have that. And they sure didn't have a printing press. So they went about preaching and teaching. And the need for writing came up because of two things. One was when they couldn't be in two places at one time and they needed to be. And so they would write. And we see that especially in the letters of Paul. 14 of the 21 letters, or 22 if you rightly count the book of Revelation as a letter, were by Paul. Paul wrote the majority of the letters, and he gives a lot of personal details about what he's doing, where he's been. So there's just many more details in his letters and many more letters by him that help us to understand how he used letters as a complement or an adjunct to his ministry to people. And the other thing that would cause people to write was, and we have to assume this because they didn't explain at length, but as their lives, the end of their lives drew near, in order to keep the testimony going, they would commit, certain ones of them committed it to writing, and that's how we have the four Gospels. Is because what the apostles experienced, they were eyewitnesses. You can preach the gospel to people and lead them to believe, and then train them up and teach them everything you know. But you cannot make them eyewitnesses that, a person either saw the resurrected Jesus before he left the earth or he didn't. And there was a finite number of people to whom Jesus appeared after he was raised from the dead. And so they couldn't go on preaching forever. So those are a couple of the drivers for why anything got put in writing at all. And, so there we have it. And we end up with 8 people who wrote 27 writings, but again, 14 of them were written by one guy, Paul, and the rest of them were written by 7 other people. Now, those eight people are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's pretty clear, right? Four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then there was Paul and Peter. And then lastly, James and Jude. Now, let's talk about the first four. Let's talk about the first four. So Matthew was one of the original 12 apostles. He was also called Levi. He had been a tax collector before he entered the full-time ministry with Jesus. Mark was a helper. Now, we first see him, we see him we can sort of look back, and the book of Acts tells us that he was a resident of Jerusalem, and he was a young man. And so he could have seen, he most likely saw Jesus the night before he was crucified. He may have seen many other things when Jesus was in Jerusalem. Now, Jesus traveled all throughout Israel, but he spent a lot of time in Jerusalem because it was the capital. That's where the temple was. That's where Jesus was presented for dedication when he was an infant, and it's certainly where he died. And so he has familiarity with Jerusalem. That's where Mark was from. But we read about Mark actively in the book of Acts as a helper of the Apostle Paul. And then later on, in one of Peter's letters, he's mentioned as a helper of Peter. And so other sources of history outside the New Testament tell us that Mark, when he wrote his gospel, was writing the memoirs of Peter, that he would listen as Peter spoke, and he took down those, and he was basically committing to writing Peter's teachings. And we're not given a lot more detail than that, but Mark was someone who had personal knowledge, but also, and much more so, had knowledge that he received from Peter and was committing those words to writing. Then comes Luke. As Mark was a co-worker of Peter and Paul, Luke was a co-worker of Paul. And Luke traveled with him, and Luke makes clear in the beginning of his gospel that he collected the information that he wrote, from a lot of different people. He was like a newspaper reporter. He was getting firsthand accounts, eyewitness accounts that he was putting together. And in the book of Acts, which he also wrote, he himself was a witness, because about a little over halfway through the book, he starts saying, we did this and our that, and they came to us. So obviously he was personally present in a lot of these things that happened with Paul. So that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John was an apostle, and he was one of the original 12 along with Peter. And that's the first four authors. Then we said there's Paul. Remember, Jesus appears to him on the road to Damascus, and Paul falls off his high horse and comes to his senses, sees the light, and becomes a preacher of the faith which he once tried to destroy. He'd been a very hardened skeptic against Jesus and the people that believed in Jesus. And particularly against people who believed in Jesus, because he thought Jesus was actually dead. He didn't believe he was resurrected. Well, he had an awakening. And then Peter, everybody knows Peter, and his fame and the things of the gospel. So that leaves only James and Jude. James and Jude were earthly brothers of Jesus. And there's another James in the Bible, actually a couple of Jameses among the apostles. There's James, the son of Zebedee, and who was the brother of the apostle John, and James, the son of Alphaeus, who we don't hear a whole lot about. But this James was the brother of Jesus. And James was a skeptic too, as was his brother Jude, the younger brother Jude. And these two men each wrote one letter each. James was 5 chapters long, and Jude's was only 1. So there were, technically speaking, 4 apostles who wrote. Just going back and summarizing them all, 4 apostles that wrote: Matthew, Peter, John, and Paul. Only 3 of those were part of the original 12. Peter John, and Matthew. Paul was called as an apostle later. Then there were two helpers, Mark, who helped both Peter and Paul, and Luke, who helped Paul, and then two brothers of Jesus. And all of them together are, their works are considered apostolic. Technically, only 4 of them were apostles, only 3 part of the original 12, but 4 of them were technically apostles. The helpers' writings are counted with the apostles because they were writing at the direction, under the wing, under the supervision of the apostles. And the same really holds true for the brothers of Jesus, James and Jude. They, after Jesus was raised from the dead, they gave up their skepticism. They bought in. They were all in. And so they would work together with the apostles. And when you read, for example, in 1 Corinthians, Paul makes reference to the brothers of the Lord in the same breath that he's talking about the apostles. So they were kind of regarded the same. What these men have in common was that they were all contemporaries. They all knew each other. They worked independently of each other, but there was a connection between all of them. Now, there were a lot of books written during the first century which were not included in the New Testament. And probably the majority of them were forgeries. Because the writings of the apostles, and particularly these 8 men, were so valued, there were people who would fake it. That you could, I guess, get a following and take up an offering and do pretty well. And, they had shysters back then, just like we have them today, or, forgers, whatever you want to call them, fraudsters. And so a lot of those books were written, and they would try to get their writings accepted in the churches. But sooner or later, they were all discovered. And these writings were all produced in the first century because these 8 men were all contemporaries of Jesus, roughly his age, certainly part of his generation. And that was a unique generation. Once the next generation came along, none of them could say they saw Jesus raised from the dead because they weren't born then. So a lot of writings during the period were rejected. There were also writings that were produced that were good writings, and they were genuine, they were authentic. For example, there were some men called apostolic fathers. That would include Polycarp, that would include Ignatius, that would include Clement. And these men wrote, and their writings were circulated, but they weren't kept with these other writings. These writings that we're talking about were kept along with the prophets of the Old Testament, and these writings were considered sacred. And that's what made the New Testament. So to be in the New Testament, a writing had to be by someone from that first generation, the generation of Jesus, from that apostolic cohort, that apostolic team. And it had to be genuinely from them, because they were the unique first generation, the one who had actually known Jesus in his physical life, and even ones like Mark and Luke, that we don't have testimony that they actually knew the earthly Jesus. They were certainly rubbing elbows with people who did, and were under their direction in terms of what writings they produced. But anything that came after that, whether, any forgery that came during the same time was rejected, and anything that came after that generation, whether it was a forgery or whether it was an authentic writing, was rejected. Whether it was good or whether it was bad, it was rejected, because this generation was unique, and these were kept separate from all other writings. So the fact that all the churches agreed when they weren't under any single hierarchical authority just really added to the assurance that these men were who they said they were. It's their identities that got their writings in the New Testament, not the writing itself. They weren't judging the writings. It was the source of the writings. The writings became holy because the men who produced them were holy. That's the 8 New Testament authors.